GE has condemned the increasing abduction and arrests of journalists by security agencies under the guise of enforcing the Cybersecurity Act. In a statement issued by the Guild's president, Mr. Eze Anaba, and its General Secretary, Iyobosa Uwugiaren, the Guild warned of the consequence of such illegal actions on press freedom. They called for a proper understanding and intention of the Cybersecurity Act, declaring that the law was enacted as a legal framework for combating cybercrimes and not for persecuting journalists who are performing their legitimate duties in our democracy. Joining us via Zoom is the managing editor, the Avalon Daily, Ayodele Adiu. Good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, we often say that the media is the fourth estate of the realm and also the watchdog of our society, especially in a democracy like ours. But when it seems that the watchdog is being attacked, seemingly attacked, what does this say, first, of that society, and what implication does this have?
Well, it has very grave implications for our democracy because, like you know, a free press is not a privilege. It's a necessity for any great society to thrive. And so the freedom of the press is not just an important thing to have. It's an imperative for a functioning democracy. And once you threaten that, you threaten the very core of a democratic society. You lose vigilance, you lose the ability to hold those in authority to account, which leads to abuse, to excesses, to impunity, and of course, to poor governance that inadvertently impoverishes the people, and leaves them in penury. So it's cardinal to always have a fair and impartial and a free press.
And when you look at the fact that we are in a time where everyone has access to the social media, to the internet, how do we strike a balance between ensuring press freedom and also the police also doing their duties? Because some experts will say that their own defense might be that whatever was published was sort of causing a breakdown of law and order and sort of tarnishing the image of an individual. So what do you make of this statement?
There's a difference between people who use social media and people who are journalists. I think it's important to make that important clarification. That journalists use social media as a tool to disseminate information or to report their story does not truly mean that there are some social media urchins who are seeking unnecessary attention or who are, like many people who lay all these petitions would like to claim, stalking people, on social media. That is truly not the case. For many journalists who use social media, it is simply an avenue to disseminate information, to share that story, and to draw attention to the important work that they are doing. But like you have rightfully said, it appears that the Cybercrime Act has become to journalists today what Decree 2 was to many journalists in the 1990s, the early 1990s and the late 1980s. A draconian law that was used to terrorize journalists, to abuse the rights of well-meaning Nigerians, to detain arbitrarily journalists for stories that offended the sensibilities of those in power and in authority. And that cannot be acceptable, especially, like I said, if you want to hold those in authority to account. Now, this does not mean that I support the abuse of such privileges that journalists do have to be watchdogs of the society. I do not excuse that certain people, have used some of these powers, or abused some of these powers that they have to hold governments to account. But at least at the bare minimum, what we would like to see is a situation where even though those in authorities are aggrieved by certain things that are published, the journalists or the platforms in which they work for should be giving fair hearing or the decency to at least arrest these individuals with their dignities intact, not what we have seen in recent times where people are essentially abducted and you cannot tell their whereabouts until there is public outcry before the arresting authorities finally decide to admit that, XYZ journalist is in their custody. We can't afford a descent into a society where rules no longer matter, where the rights of individuals are abused arbitrarily. There has to be a level of decorum, especially, looking back where we are coming from, and the fact that we have to make progress, collectively as a society. So it's important because even these people who make many of these arrests, when they run into trouble, when they are sacked or when they are wrongly treated, they always run to the journalists to carry their stories. So why would you treat journalists with such impunity and such disregard, for a story that seems to offend the sensibilities of those in authority? I always say that, journalists are in the business of printing what those in power do not like, because the moment those in authority enjoy what journalists write every day, then you cease to be journalists. You have become public relations officers and not journalists. It's not the job of the journalists to sing praises of those in authority. That's why they have spokespersons. That's why they have public relations organizations on retainer. The job of the journalist is to hold those in power to account. And that is exactly what the citizens of this country would like to see. Especially at a time where they're dealing with they're dealing with very serious economic challenges, and they're grappling with, the daily hustle, and trying to survive this harsh economic climate.
Right. Now, because of the matter of accountability that you brought forward, there are those who will say matters of accountability or holding persons to account might be relative as it is, depending on who is reading and how they interpret it. How can we navigate this path in such a way that journalists are fair and balanced in their approach towards this matter of accountability in our democracy?
Well, I think every trained journalist understands the basic principle when you're reporting, especially investigative stories, the fact that you have to give the person, in some instances, a right of hearing, which means you get their own side of the story. And if you have done your own part to seek the side of the story, of the people or the person that you're writing about, and they prove to be evasive, and you do all you can, nobody stops you from going ahead to write the story, publish and be damned, right? And like I said, if people feel aggrieved, they have the right to seek redress in court and let the courts make the final pronouncements. What we're against is a situation where you abduct journalists, where journalists are tortured, where journalists have to go through untold hardship because of stories that they report. It's unconscionable and it's unacceptable. And I'd like to find a situation where other media organizations, civil society organizations, and the Nigerian citizens rally around these journalists who go through this very, very uncomfortable and sometimes overbearing overbearing processes by security agencies. It's unacceptable, except, of course, we admit that we no longer want to run, a democracy, and we want to decide to be under some. Even at the height of military dictatorship, journalists stood up to be counted. Listen, if you permit me, and I think it's important to remind journalists and the Nigerian people what certain journalists had to go through. And because, again, this particular administration, was in the forefront of the Nadeco movement, and many people in this administration were icons of the press at the time where they stood up to military dictatorship. You would recall where the likes of Bayo and Onuga walked out of the African Concord because they did a story that offended the sensibilities of General Ibrahim Babangida, and they refused to retract. They decided to resign and go out and start their own newspaper because they believed in a free press and a press that held those in authority to account. You will recall that the same Bayo Ononuga and his colleagues, the likes of Sheike and Dakpo Oloriyomi, and of course, Babafemi Ojodu, when they reported the story of the phantom coup that essentially saved the lives of so many young officers, the likes, of President Obasanjo and the likes who were implicated in that particular phantom coup in 1995. And all of these journalists, the likes of George Umba, the likes of Kula Ajibade, were sentenced to life in prison for daring to report the truth that soldiers were tortured to death. The likes of Major Oni was killed in detention because of a phantom coup story, right? And so these journalists stood up to be counted during military dictatorship in their early 20s and in their early 30s. They did not care for their lives. They stood up for what they believed in. And so they are in power now. Many of them are in power today. And I'm surprised that they will tolerate this level of abuse against journalists in our country. And it's important that we hold this engagement and remind them of the struggle that they led during their and to know that the press is not necessarily antagonist to those in power, but really and truly it's in the business of holding people to account. And it's nothing malicious. It's just that those in power need to be accountable to the Nigerian people. And
talking about being accountable to the Nigerian people, I understand that the Cybercrime Act was, had some sort of revisions earlier this year. But what do you make of these persons in power, like you mentioned, utilizing state institutions to address civil crises? If this goes on, what is going to be the use of exploring civil court for civil cases which should be addressed, cases that should have ended with just probably an apology or a retract of the statement?
Well, I have to be very honest with you that I am pained. I'm extremely pained, not just because that there is, like you rightfully had said in your introduction, the rise of the abuse on journalists, but I'm really pained because, like I said, many of the actors in this administration, and indeed many of the people in this party, were proponents of the free press in the 1990s. I mean, think of the former governor of Ekiti State, who was behind one of the principal actors of Radio Kudirat, who at the time, were a thorn in the flesh of the military dictators. Think of the time where many of them were part of those who ran what Wole Soyinka later described as guerrilla journalism, because they were moving from one location to the other under the threats of military men who were trying to arrest them to continue to publish the tempo news at the time. The soldiers could not tell where they were printing from, but that passion and that dedication led them to move from house to house, from location to location. At some point, if you speak to the likes of Kunle Ajibade, they were even printing at the house of the late Alhaji Jakonde. So if people went through that hardship and that period where many of them were sentenced to life imprisonment, the likes of Nosai Giabo Ditel was arrested on the 24th of December while he was having dinner with his family and was thrown into jail, right? The likes of George Umba were tortured in the DMI headquarters, punished, his legs broken for several months under the torture of Colonel Omenka. The likes of Sojo Omotunde, now in the nation, had his legs completely, till today he still lives because of a story that they reported on monies that were freezed out of the country at the time. He was locked in a boot, driven to Abuja, and detained for 6 months. Now, these people faced these very brutish experiences in the 1990s. And I'm afraid and I'm disappointed that many of them are either in power or connected to those in power today. And they seem to have a complete intolerance, for press freedom. And that has to change. The president today was the biggest champion of the free press. And I would hope that he leans on the Inspector General of Police. He leans on many of these security agencies who seem to abuse this Cybersecurity Act, which, like you rightfully said, had been amended earlier this year, and the provision that they rely on to abuse the privileges of journalists have actually been expunged. So we cannot have a repetition of Decree 2 masked as a Cybercrime Act, at a time where we're living in a free society and in a democratic dispensation. So the president himself, who was a champion of the free press, his chief spokesperson, Bayo Onanuga, who was a publisher of one of the most notorious paper at the time, the Tempo News, the Minister of Communication, who Mohammed Idris, who himself was a publisher, all of these individuals should stand up to be counted as we speak and not allow this impunity against journalists to continue in our darling country.
I like the fact that you had to refresh our minds and the minds of the viewers with regards to how these persons performed in the 90s when they had to fight for our democracy as it is. And so that young journalists can also learn what's important when it comes to practicing journalism in our country, because afterwards, we had our democracy, and we are counting 25 years on, and we are experiencing these kinds of issues. My question then is, what would it take for us now to have a healthy press, a press that is free to express itself the way it should? Yes, some parts of the Cybercrime Act has been expunged, like you rightly pointed out, but much more than that, we need to do more as it is.
I agree with you. And it starts by the press itself taking themselves very seriously. A lot of journalists have thrown their dignities away. A lot of journalists do not realize the privileged positions that they have. And I dare say a lot of media organizations are also falling prey, right? Because, we can't have a situation where, to put it bluntly, many media organizations are simply in bed with those in government. We give awards to people in power, even before they even spend a year in office. We're giving all sorts of awards, calling them all sorts of accolades. We need to go back to a place of respect and a place of dignity. You cannot have a situation. Listen, I do media relations across the continent, and I have to deal with journalists in several countries, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Rwanda, in Ghana. And I can tell you for free, my sister, you cannot simply call your phone and call editors to a phantom press meeting in these countries. But in Nigeria, if you hear how people talk about journalists, I just call them, you give them 15,000 naira. You give them, we have to come back to a place of dignity, where we understand our role in the society, where we do not accept a situation where we'll be giving handouts, by politicians or corporate Nigeria to simply become, their mouthpiece. That is unacceptable, So we have to get back to that point where we have dignity. And it's important also for me to emphasize that the Nigerian people also must be willing to support a free press. You cannot afford for media organizations to die. Your 5 naira, your 100 naira, your 1,000 naira, support free press. You have a lot of media organizations who are struggling for financing, who are doing exceptional work. FIJ, ICRC, Premium Times, many media organizations who do the work. Make donations to these organizations, stand by them, support them in everything that you do. If you can, your organizations to take adverts in this organization so that they can continue to do the work of the free press. Because if you do not support, a free press, those who want to destroy the free press would have a free rein, in doing that. So it's a collective effort. The Nigerian people have to support them because ultimately the journalists are doing the work to ensure that we live in a free and liberal society. And we have an obligation to also support the work that they do by patronizing them and by supporting their work.
So the 2024 World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders listed Nigeria among the most challenging countries for journalists, especially in West Africa. And Nigeria was ranked 112th position out of 180 countries. But this is an improvement from the ranking in 2023, which was 123. So my question is, how do we sift through the bad eggs, those who pose as journalists, to be able to, make a difference in the country, looking at the what we're talking about of press freedom, there are people who pose as journalists but are not journalists. So what is the press doing? What are we doing as press, men of the fourth estate of the realm, in making sure that these bad eggs are expunged from the system?
Well, you have to invest in training and development. There's no two ways about it. You have to train, retrain, and reinvest in journalists so that there's a clear distinction between quacks and those who are posing as journalists and the real journalist. Because if you can identify quality journalism, what usually happens is that people will naturally gravitate towards people of quality, people of substance, people who they can rely on for quality information. The water becomes murky when you cannot separate the wheat from the chaff, where those who are supposed to report quality news and give you quality reporting do not have the capacity or the requisite knowledge to do their jobs. And then people have to rely on quacks. So we have to invest a lot in capacity building. We need foundations that will invest critically in developing the capacity and the skills of journalists. And we have to support organizations that are already doing that. You have the Journalist Clinic that is run by Taiwo Obe, a fantastic journalist who is doing the work to train journalists. We have to support people like that. You have to support people, like Mr. Lekon, who is trying to retrain journalists, and all of those who are out there who are trying to build the capacity and capabilities of journalists in our country. We have to do that, except we support, the training and development of journalists across our country. Then we'll give opportunities for quacks to take over the entire space, and there wouldn't be any differentiating factor. In fact, let me tell you, what many people do not know is that the best books that you read across the world on foreign policy, on the economy, on sports and things like that are actually written by journalists, right? But you don't have those kind of quality here, even though you hear that somebody has reported a beat for 15 years. Where is the expertise after reporting maritime activities for 15 years? Where is the expertise after reporting the presidency for 15 years, or the economy, or the Central Bank of Nigeria? Where are the quality books that have been written? Where are the papers that have informed research work in the country? They do not exist. And
that's a big question.
Investment in training and development of these journalists, and that needs to happen. It can't just be done, by media organizations alone who are struggling for funds, or by people like that who are passionate about it. But we need many foundations in our country, corporate Nigeria, who will put back monies.
Absolutely, Ayodele. And I like the fact that we're going to wrap up on that note. Training, capacity building is very important moving forward. We must thank you, Managing Editor, The Avalon Daily, Ayodele Adio, for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Right. And it's on that note we